Shooting .22 long rifle can be a lot of fun, but having constant issues with failure to feed, extract, and eject can certainly make that a very annoying experience, especially if you're coming from centerfire when you're not used to having that many failures. So today we're going to talk about all the common failures that are related to feeding, extraction, ejection. I'm going to demystify those, hopefully, show you some of the major components and the things that I picked up over the last 3 or 4 years shooting a multitude of rimfires, working with several prominent rimfire gunsmiths, and diagnosing a lot of my buddies' issues, so that hopefully you'll understand, one, how the components in each of these systems work and how you can self-remedy these issues, diagnose and fix them on your own. Now, some of these will require a gunsmith, but knowing is half the battle, so let's get straight into it. I'm Josh, this is The Pursuit of Accuracy, and this is the dummy guide to fixing your rimfire issues. Alright, so a couple pieces of administrative notes is that we're going to be talking about a bunch of different rimfires, everything from CZs to Anshoots to Voodoos and Rimx's. So we're talking very much production rifle all the way up to custom rifle. And believe me, they all have their issues. And most of these components are almost identically the same all the way up. But I do want to make a couple of key notes. When we're talking about CZs and Anshoots, rifles like that primarily use these smaller mags, these magazines index to the rifle themselves. That means to the rifle, there's a magazine housing that this magazine goes into. So we typically don't see magazine issues unless the magazine itself is broken. So feeding issues where you have mags that go directly to the rifle that are not indexed by the stock or the chassis typically don't have feeding issues. So if you do see them, you need to check the magazine, and usually it's going to be something like dirt and debris in the magazine. However, inversely, when we start talking about the higher end guns that use these AICS pattern mags, these mags index off the stock or the chassis. So you have the rifle that goes into the stock and then the magazine that attaches to the stock, and usually they're adjustable because these do take a little bit of fiddling. So when we talk about magazine feeding issues and adjusting mag height and those things, we're talking about the AICS style magazines that you would see in the Bergara B14R, the Rimx, the Voodoo, the Remington 40X, those kind of rifles. So I'm going to chapter mark this to make this a little bit easier. If you're having a specific problem, you can skip forward to that, but I think it's probably a good idea to start at the very beginning. And the first issue that most people have is feeding. And again, if you're using a CZ or something like that that has a magazine that affixes directly to the actual barreled action, then likely you're not going to have any issues. If you are, it's probably going to be an issue with the magazine itself. What we're going to be talking about is magazine to action fitment and how that can affect your overall feeding experience. So for 90% of the rifles out there, we are talking about a controlled feed system. That even includes the CZ. While I think it's really not actually intended to be a controlled feed, it really is controlled feed. And let me get you up close so I can show you up close and personal exactly what I'm talking about. All right, so when we're talking about a controlled round feed, what we mean is we have a bolt here. This is actually a 40X bolt in a Voodoo mag. Is that the bolt is going to ride over the top of the magazine like this across the feed lips, and it's going to push the bullet forward out into that groove. And as you can see there, the bullet pops up into the bolt face. So on the bolt face, we have both the extractor and the pusher. So the pusher is a tensioner, and that extractor actually has a hook. That's what's responsible for pulling the bolt out. But that bullet needs to jump up into the face of this bolt. So, well, why is that important? Well, a lot of guys have feeding issues because the magazine has a lot of slop. And what I like to do as a general rule of thumb is close the bolt in the action, install the magazine until basically these two are mated together, and you can leave a little bit of slop. There's a little bit of trial and error there, but typically when you see failure to feed issues, usually it's because there's too much magazine slop and this bolt's going to ride right over top of the bullet, or it's going to have to do with something with this extractor and pusher. So these are sprung, and that's going to be the same in the 40X, the Bergara, the Voodoo. They have two sprung extractors. Basically, one's an extractor, one is a pusher. So while that extractor has the claw, the pusher is more just kind of, sometimes it has a claw and sometimes it's just kind of a blunt thing. It just puts pressure on the round. But there's a little bit of a dance going on here that most people don't know about, and you'll hear about this again in the future when we start talking about extraction and, more importantly, ejection issues. So because we have those two sprung devices on top of the bolt face, the bullet has to push up and pass this. And you should be able to do this with your bolt out with a round like this. There shouldn't be any major points of resistance, and more or less it should slip right into the bolt face. So if your rifle was feeding great before and all of a sudden now after some use it's not feeding as good, usually what you feel is kind of a notchy feeding issue. Not that it won't feed, but it gets a little bit more notchy, and you start having rounds kind of nosedive into the chamber. A lot of time it's because you've built up dirt and debris in the channels where these springs are. Now you can look out for your particular rifle, but you need to get these out. You need to clean that channel out. You need to keep that nice and clean, because it is intended to have a certain amount of resistance that's going to let that bullet slide in. Now, an easy way to test if this is happening to you is to take your rifle, and obviously do this outdoors on the range in a safe place. Make sure all the safety protocols are being followed, but slowly load a round up to the point where it jumps into the bolt face. As it jumps into the bolt face, you want to stop right there. And if you have some sort of notchy feeding issue, you can actually look at the relation to where that round is in your bolt face. And a lot of the times what you're going to see is that that round will be in the bolt face, but not all the way up to where you can actually push on it. You can even take a little screwdriver in from the side of the action and push on it and watch it go deeper into the bolt face. Because if that cartridge isn't getting all the way up in the bolt face, it's not going to align with the chamber. It's not going to work how the controlled feed system is supposed to work, because there's no ramp there. It's going to hit the chamber, and that's usually that notchy feeling. Again, that's usually something going on with the extractor and pusher in here. Usually some sort of buildup or debris has found its way in there, and that is going to be typical of almost everything. Now, on something like a CZ, sometimes that can be something worn out, something caught up, but the same thing. The first thing to check when you're having feeding issues, especially notchy kind of feeding issues, one, check your mag height. Two, slow it down, get it to right where that bullet jumps into the bolt face, make sure it's going all the way up. If it's not, it's probably time to take apart that bolt, clean everything out, and retest, and that usually solves 90% of the problems I see. And this is going to bring us to problem number 2, which is usually going to take either some gunsmithing intervention or you buying some shims, and that is failure to fire. So, and I've seen this countless times where guys shoot CCI standard velocity, LePou also thing, well, they go to Ely and they start getting misfires, and you either assume it's the ammunition or something went wrong with the firing pin, and usually it's neither. Almost 99.99999% of the time when I see people having issues with Ely and having light strikes and those kind of things, it is almost always headspace. Now, if you have something like the Bergara B14R or the CZ457, this is a really easy fix, because you can order bolt shims, and what that's going to do is decrease the headspace. And again, this is super common to see guys go from shooting CCI or LePou or RWS to Ely. And that's because the Ely rim thickness here is actually a thinner diameter. So when you think about it, your headspace is built off of from where your bolt face is to the breech of your barrel. So if you have a thicker rim, that means that it's basically taking up more room the less headspace you have. And then when you go to a thinner rim like Ely, now you're increasing headspace. And most times, like I said, 99.99999% of the time, it is headspace. Guys that I've seen or myself that I've had issues, especially with the Bergara or the CZ, I've gotten bolt shims, completely taking the problem away. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, if you're shooting a Voodoo, 40X, something like that, that's when you're likely going to have to involve your gunsmith if you want to shoot that. I know Voodoo will send out extra power springs, and sometimes that helps, but probably the reality there is that's more of a band-aid than actually fixing the problem. The problem, from what I've seen almost all the time, is headspace. So if you don't fall into those categories generically, one thing you can do is just check your bolt. Make sure that your firing pin is in good shape. Make sure that everything is clean and moving as it should. Outside of that, again, we typically don't see those parts just break and stop working, especially on CZ457 and up quality firearms. Typically, it comes down to something like headspace. All right, and that's going to lead us into our next fun one, which I've experienced quite a bit, especially with a CZ. That's failure to extract. This, again, is going to be a very common problem, but usually when you start putting pre-fit barrels on things, most factory guns are pretty good, but when you're talking about production guns, the CZ457, the Tikka T1X, the Bergara, sometimes you get a rifle with a little bit of looser headspace. And again, yep, I'm bringing back up headspace because this is usually the problem. First of all, you should inspect your bolt. Make sure that your extractor hook, nothing is damaged. and then you can kind of slowly close the bolt over and just check. So here's kind of how I go about diagnosing and fixing extraction issues. So if I get something that is commonly not extracting, one thing you can do to kind of cheat is to fire the round, and if you get one that doesn't extract, it leaves the empty in, go ahead and close back on it, refire the firing pin. You can take a small screwdriver and apply a little pressure to the extractor side. So it's got a spring that's keeping this hook on your bullet. If you apply a little bit of pressure at the same time you open and pull the bolt back and it does extract it, that can tell you that your spring or tensioning system, whether it's something like the CZ, which is this big spring clip, or something like a Bergara, which has an internal spring, that can let you know that that spring is weak and that's why you're not extracting. A lot of times I find though that it's because someone put in a pre-fit, the headspace is a little loose, and once they either adjust that on the pre-fit barrel or install a bolt shim to kind of get that extractor closer, allow it to go up and over that round a little bit more, then the rifle starts extracting again. But again, that's kind of how I go about doing it. First, I'm going to check the bolt, make sure that nothing is broken or worn out. Obviously it is, that needs to be replaced. The next is to reproduce it in the rifle and add a little bit of tension by just putting a little tiny screwdriver right there on the extractor as you're pulling the round out, and that fixes it. That'll let you know that it's probably something to do with the tension. And to our last common issue, and probably the most prevalent issue, that is ejections. So we fired the bullet, we've got the empty cartridge out of the chamber, but what happens a lot now is that that empty gets left in the action. It kind of just pops off the bolt face. You go to feed the next round and guess what? It jams up. We've all been there, and this is yet another tension issue, another bolt face issue. So as long as your action is clean and nothing is broken, typically what's happening, and you can imagine that this isn't empty and not alive, is this bolt and empty is being dragged right back across the top here, right? So there is a little bit of a catch when you drag across the top of these bullets with the empty from that empty cartridge over the bullets in the magazine. Well, it is this pusher side, the interior side, so we commonly refer to the outside, the open port area, as the extractor. That's the direction that the brass is going to come out of the action. And the left side's the pusher. That's the side responsible for having tension on that empty cartridge as it passes over those bullets. And then eventually it's going to hit some sort of ejector. So it's just a hard piece of material that is going to force this empty out. So more often than not, I see this pop up in Bergaras, and as you can see, we're looking at the bolt from the top down here. This would be the extractor side, and the extractors on the Bergara bolts have a lot of factory tension. Well, on the pusher side, they don't have as much, and you need that because they've got to get the bullet up in there, but I've seen ones with less tension than this, and what happens is they leave the empty behind. Well, the only way around this is to increase the tension on the pusher. If the pusher itself is not damaged on a Bergara, what I've seen guys do is take a little teeny tiny BB or ball bearing and put it in the channel that the spring rides. Then they put the spring back in over that. It increases the tension, and that resolves some of the problems. Now, you can see that on the CZs, but again, because they share one big spring, you're probably likely already experiencing a problem with extraction. So you're fixing both the extraction and the ejection with one spring because they're using the same exact spring to tension and to extract. Now, things like a 40X or Voodoo, they also have individual springs. And again, that is something that you can diagnose by probably cleaning out that kind of chamber where the spring and that pusher and extractor ride. Usually if it was working and all of a sudden stopped working, these parts typically do not break, but they do build up crud and all sorts of things from being run in the gun, and they can eventually lead to problems like that. So I know we went over a lot, and these are real specific to Rimfire, but again, one thing, a big takeaway at the end of this is you need to understand the relationship of how these sprung style extractors, which are 95% of the Rimfires we have sprung style extractors, whether the CZ with a big spring clip or they're a Voodoo style or even the 40X. They have these sprung extractors, and this is usually where problems come because there are channels with springs and they will fill up with dirt and debris, and eventually they will stop working. Keeping your bolt face clean, keeping that all serviced will help you out quite a bit. But again, we have a symbiotic relationship here of tension. So we need enough tension so that this reliably extracts and ejects and gets that empty out of the rifle. But you can't have so much that it makes it hard for the cartridge to get in the bolt face when being fed. So we have a little bit of a finesse going on between the fact that we need to feed this up straight up into the bolt face without much resistance so that the pressure from the magazine can reliably feed bullets all the way up into the bolt face, and then have enough tension to then again come out, extract, and eject. So it is a finely tuned system, so it doesn't take a lot to disrupt it. So hopefully this answers a bunch of questions. These are a lot of problems that I've seen over the years, kind of how I go about diagnosing them, and just understanding how all this works in your system will make it easy for you to diagnose your problems, figure out what you need to fix it, and get your gun back up and running. I appreciate you guys watching. Catch you on the next one.